He died of exhaustion so that his daughter could live. She stood nearby in a beautiful dress, not realizing that she was now alone. But fate brought her together with a woman who had also lost everything, and she made a decision that changed both their lives. See how this story ends. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Elizabeth Harper had once been known in her circle as a woman who carried everything with grace, the kind of figure people admired from afar and envied quietly. She had built her firm from the ground up, had cultivated a reputation for intellect and poise, and had been blessed with a family that completed her existence, a devoted husband, Michael, and their only daughter, Anna. But all of that was 3 years in the past. Before the night, a speeding truck, a patch of black ice, and one cruel twist of fate destroyed the picture of wholeness she had taken for granted. Now she lived in the aftermath, a survivor in name only, her life stripped down to its cold mechanical rhythms. Every day resembled the one before it. She rose early, though not from rest, but from the restless battle against sleep that never soothed. She dressed in tailored suits, her hair and makeup immaculate, and left the apartment that felt less like home and more like a mausoleum. She drove to her office in the city, signed contracts, advised clients, attended board meetings, and delivered sharp remarks that made her seem alive. Yet each gesture was an echo. She performed competence because that was what had always been expected of her. Success was no longer triumph. It was routine. And when she returned each evening, the silence waiting behind the locked door was more suffocating than the long hours she endured in meeting rooms. The apartment remained unchanged from the day of the accident. Her husband's leather jacket still hung by the door, as though he might return at any moment to shrug into it and smile at her across the hallway. The shelves in Anna's bedroom were filled with books and trinkets of a girl's young adulthood. A music box with a broken hinge, a worn, stuffed bear kept even in college, the ribbons from old track meets. Elizabeth could not bring herself to pack anything away. The idea of erasing their presence felt like a second betrayal, so she lived among ghosts, each room a chamber of memory, each object an accusation of her survival. At night, the silence pressed harder. She tried reading, but the words slipped past her unfocused eyes. She tried the television, but the voices of actors grated against the quiet she had learned to endure. More often, she sat with a glass of wine untouched in her hand, staring at the glow of city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows, wondering how so many people could keep moving when her own world had collapsed. The wealth she had accumulated mocked her with its uselessness. It had not saved her husband, it had not saved her daughter, and it could not save her from herself. Depression seeped into the smallest corners of her routine. She woke with the weight of dread pressing against her chest. Meals were perfunctory and sometimes entirely skipped. Friends stopped calling when they realized she no longer returned invitations or answered questions about how she was coping. In truth, she could not bear to sit across a table and hear about grandchildren or family trips, to watch laughter spill so easily from others while she carried only ashes. Her work was the last tether to normalcy, but even there she drifted, the passion for problem-solving long extinguished. On one particularly gray afternoon, the walls of her apartment closed in tighter than usual. She could not sit another hour beneath the accusing stillness of photographs, nor pace another circle across the same cold floors. Without a plan, she put on her coat and stepped outside. The wind stung, and the sky hung heavy with clouds, a dull iron lid over the city. She walked quickly at first, then slowly, then without direction at all, carried by the motion of her own legs through streets she rarely visited. The neighborhoods grew rougher the farther she went. Storefronts faded, sidewalks cracked, the air tinged with the smell of exhaust and damp pavement. She was thinking of nothing, of everything, of the pointlessness of each step, when she saw the small crowd gathered near the corner outside a pharmacy. People stood in a loose half-circle, shifting uneasily, eyes fixed on the ground. Elizabeth's pace slowed. At first she thought it was some minor altercation, perhaps an argument, but then she saw the body stretched across the concrete. A man lay motionless, his clothing thin and frayed, his skin drawn tightly over bone, as though hunger had carved him hollow. His face was gaunt, lips pale, hands trembling in stillness even as his chest failed to rise. Beside him knelt a girl no older than 5. her small hands clinging to his, her voice rising in sobs. She was dressed in a dress so incongruous with the scene that Elizabeth felt the breath leave her chest. The fabric was bright, satin trimmed with lace, a ribbon tied neatly around her waist. It was the sort of dress a child might wear to a holiday gathering or a birthday party, not to stand in the chill of late winter on a city sidewalk. Thin tights clung to her legs, and her shoes were worn but polished, as though someone had cared deeply that she looked her best. She shook his arm, her face blotched with tears, calling to him again and again, as though sheer force of will might rouse him. Elizabeth moved forward without thinking, pushing through the uncertain ring of onlookers. The crowd parted reluctantly, no one daring to do more than stare. She knelt beside the man, felt the brittle cold of his hand beneath the child's grip, and shouted for someone to call an ambulance. Her voice was sharper than she intended, but urgency filled the air where passivity had reigned. She tried to shield the girl with her coat, draping it over her shoulders against the cold. Though the child resisted, clutching her father's arm desperately, unwilling to let go. The minutes stretched long and merciless until the ambulance arrived. Paramedics lifted the man with swift efficiency, their eyes betraying the futility of their work before their hands had finished. Elizabeth watched, holding the girl close though the child hardly acknowledged her presence. The siren wailed, the doors slammed, and within moments the vehicle was gone, carrying him not to safety but to the quiet certainty of death pronounced too late. The crowd dispersed quickly once the spectacle ended, leaving Elizabeth and the girl standing alone in the chill. The child's sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths, her small fingers still clutching the edge of the dress that shimmered faintly under the streetlight. Elizabeth looked down at her, and for the first time in years felt something stir beneath the ice of her grief. It was not comfort, but recognition. The girl's wide eyes, brimming with terror and loss, mirrored her own reflection from nights spent staring into glass, with no one left beside her. She guided the girl to a nearby bench, wrapping the coat more firmly around her, waiting until the social worker who had been called arrived. The process was formal, almost cold. Questions asked, papers filled, instructions given. The child's name, she learned, was Lily. No relatives were immediately found. She would be taken to a temporary care center. The details blurred in Elizabeth's mind, overtaken by the image that would not fade. The frail man stretched lifeless on the pavement, and his daughter standing above him in a dress too fine for such a cruel place. That night when Elizabeth returned to her apartment, the silence felt different. The ghost of her husband's jacket still hung by the door. Her daughter's room still waited untouched. But another ghost had joined them. A child's sob, a satin ribbon, the helpless weight of a hand too small to hold on to the world alone. Elizabeth lay awake until dawn, the image refusing to leave her, and for the first time in years she wondered if her life might yet be forced into motion again, not by her own desire, but by a stranger's desperate need. The morning after the scene outside the pharmacy, Elizabeth awoke with the same tightness in her chest that had plagued her for years. But now there was a new weight pressing against it. She could not shake the image of the child. The girl's cries, the way her small frame trembled in the cold, the stark contrast of that bright dress against the grayness of the street and the lifeless body of her father, all of it haunted her. It followed her through her shower, into her kitchen, across the silent table where her coffee cooled untouched. She tried to bury herself in work, opening her laptop to face the flood of emails and tasks that normally consumed her, but the words blurred. Contracts, financial projections, board demands, all of it seemed trivial compared to the memory of that little girl gripping her father's limp hand as though she could anchor him back to life. Later that day, she found herself on the phone with a contact in social services, the voice on the other end polite but mechanical, reciting details with practiced detachment. The man's name had been Michael Ward, 37 years old. Formerly employed at the steel plant before it had closed 2 years ago, leaving hundreds without steady work. He had taken odd jobs, small tasks, but none provided stability. The cause of death had been complications from untreated diabetes, combined with severe malnutrition. He had simply wasted away piece by piece, his body devoured by neglect not of his daughter, but of himself. He had spent what little money he earned on the child, making sure she ate, making sure she had medicine, making sure she never felt the hunger that gnawed at him day after day. Elizabeth closed her eyes and listened, her grip tightening around the phone. She thought of her own refrigerator at home, stocked with fruit, imported cheeses, fine cuts of meat she rarely touched. She thought of Michael's last days, his body collapsing from within, while he forced himself to smile for the little girl who had been his entire world. The social worker mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had refused assistance more than once. Some said pride, others said shame, but perhaps it had been fear of losing his daughter if the system saw his weakness. He had chosen sacrifice, the most complete kind. That evening, Elizabeth accompanied one of the social workers to Michael's apartment. It was a small unit in a crumbling complex on the edge of the city, paint peeling from the walls, the hallway reeking faintly of mildew and old cooking grease. Inside, the air was colder than outside, the kind of chill that seeped into the bones and lingered. The rooms were bare, almost austere. There was a sagging couch with torn fabric, a table with a missing leg braced by bricks, a bed in the corner covered with a threadbare blanket. The refrigerator hummed quietly, nearly empty inside. A bottle of water, half a loaf of stale bread, a small carton of milk long expired. Yet in the midst of this poverty, there was a corner that stood apart. A small bed neatly made, a row of children's books stacked carefully on a shelf, a stuffed rabbit with worn ears but stitched carefully at the seam. And hanging from a hook on the wall, carefully pressed and spotless, was the dress. Elizabeth stepped closer, her hand hovering before she touched it. The satin fabric gleamed softly even in the dim light, the lace at the hem intact, the ribbon tied in a perfect bow. It was absurdly out of place, like a jewel in the dust, a fragment of celebration in a life that had known only hardship. The social worker explained what she already sensed. Michael had bought the dress only weeks before his death. A neighbor had seen him staring at it in the window of a second-hand boutique, had seen him walk past several times before finally entering. He had emerged carrying the package, and for once, there had been a spark of pride in his expression. For his daughter, he had surrendered the last of his savings. He had chosen not to buy himself a coat for the winter, not to refill his medicine, not to replace his shoes that were splitting at the seams. Instead, he had given his daughter something that made her feel cherished, something that told her she mattered. Elizabeth stood frozen, imagining the moment he had presented it to his little girl. Perhaps it had been on an ordinary evening, the two of them eating quietly together at the small table. Perhaps he had pulled the dress from its bag with a smile that masked the fatigue in his body, watching her eyes widen as she clutched the fabric to her chest. She saw it now, the image of a father who had nothing but still found a way to give beauty. And then she remembered the cruel contrast, his last breath taken in tattered clothes, while she stood above him in that very dress, too thin to keep her warm, too fragile against the winter wind. The neighbor, a woman with gray hair and tired eyes, spoke softly from the doorway. She said Michael had been a good man, a quiet man, always tired but always kind. He had played with his daughter in the courtyard, pushing her gently on the swing, clapping when she danced. He had starved himself, they all knew, but no one realized how far it had gone. He had refused charity, never begged, never complained. And then, just like that, he was gone. Elizabeth listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the dress. She felt a storm rising inside her, a combination of grief for this man she had never known, rage at a world that had let him disappear unseen, and shame for herself. She had so much, too much, and yet her days had been consumed by emptiness. He had had nothing, yet he had poured every ounce of his existence into his child until there was nothing left. His legacy was not money or success or reputation. It was a child loved so fiercely that even in death, his devotion was visible in every stitch of satin and lace. Driving home, Elizabeth's thoughts spun relentlessly. The city lights blurred past, but she saw only two images: the man's frail body on the pavement and the girl's bright dress glowing like defiance in the cold. She returned to her apartment, to the polished floors and gleaming countertops, and for the first time the space felt not merely empty, but obscene. Her wealth could not save her family, yet she had guarded it as though it mattered. Michael had died penniless, Yet he had left behind something more enduring than any fortune, the memory of sacrifice carved into the life of his child. That night she could not sleep. She walked from room to room, her steps echoing. She paused in her daughter's room, touched the edge of the bedspread, and closed her eyes. In the quiet, she saw Lily again, clutching her father's arm, standing in that radiant dress. It was more than fabric. It was a symbol of a father's love so absolute it consumed him, and it was now a burden on the shoulders of a child too young to carry it alone. By dawn, Elizabeth understood something had shifted inside her. For 3 years, she had lived in a house of ghosts, shackled to the memory of what she had lost. But now she saw another path, one she had not expected, one she had not even wanted. The girl in the dress remained alone in the world, and the memory of her father's sacrifice demanded something more than sympathy. It demanded witness. It demanded action. And Elizabeth, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of a decision forming within her, a decision that might finally drag her from the shadow of grief and into the fragile light of purpose. The decision that had been stirring in Elizabeth after her visit to Michael's apartment did not arrive in the form of a single revelation. It seeped into her slowly, like light breaking through cracks in a boarded window. She went to bed that night unsettled, unable to shake the memory of the dress and the emptiness of that home. And when she woke the next morning, the feeling had not lessened. It followed her into her office, into the meetings where she nodded absently, into the elevator ride back down to the city streets where her own reflection in the polished doors looked less like a successful woman than a hollow echo of one. For days she carried the weight of that little girl's image in her mind until finally it became unbearable to ignore. She could not return to the indifference that had shaped her life these past years. Something within her demanded more. The first step came quietly. She found herself attending Michael's funeral. It was a small affair, scarcely more than a handful of neighbors, a social worker, and the weary minister who recited prayers over a plain coffin. The air was cold, and the cemetery soil, still damp from rain, clung to the shoes of those gathered. Elizabeth stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold with an ache that caught her by surprise. She had not known this man in life, yet his death struck her as more profound than the grand services she had once attended for wealthy associates and friends of her circle. Here was a man who had left no fortune, no legacy in buildings or companies, but who had given everything he had in the simplest and purest form to his daughter. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Elizabeth noticed the small figure at the graveside. Lily stood there, the same bright dress visible beneath a borrowed coat that looked too large for her thin shoulders. She clutched a stuffed rabbit in her arms, silent, her eyes red but dry, as if she had already wept beyond her years. Elizabeth felt compelled to move closer, to be present, though she hesitated. Her instinct was to shield the girl, to offer comfort, but something in the child's composure held her back. It was the strength of survival, the stubborn endurance of one who had already lost everything and learned that the world did not stop for grief. That evening, Elizabeth wrote a check to cover the costs of the burial, ensuring there was no lingering debt left behind. It was a small gesture, meaningless in comparison to the enormity of loss, but it was the beginning of something more. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth could not remain distant. She began visiting the care center where Lily had been placed. The first visit was awkward, the child withdrawn, sitting in the corner with her stuffed rabbit, her hair tangled, her eyes watching everything with guarded suspicion. Elizabeth sat beside her, not speaking at first, only present. She brought with her small things, a set of colored pencils, a storybook, but Lily accepted them with little more than a nod. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her voice was so soft that Elizabeth had to lean forward to catch the words. Yet even in her silence, the child carried with her the imprint of the dress, for she wore it still, refusing to take it off even when the fabric grew stained and frayed. The caregivers at the center confided that Lily resisted every attempt to dress her in anything else. They tried sweaters, jeans, new clothes donated by volunteers, but each time she shook her head, clutching the dress tightly, her small fingers gripping the ribbon at her waist as though it alone tethered her to her father's memory. They allowed it, though they worried. Elizabeth understood. The dress had become more than clothing. It was her father's last gift, a shield against the void of his absence, a reminder that she had been loved. To ask her to remove it would be to strip away the last connection she had left. Elizabeth's visits became routine. She would arrive after work, sometimes late in the evening, when the other children had already been tucked into bed. She would sit beside Lily as she drew pictures with the pencil she had brought, crude sketches of houses, of trees, of a figure that might have been her father. At first, the girl never drew Elizabeth, but over time small details appeared, a second figure near the house, a taller shadow beside the child. Elizabeth did not remark on it, but she noticed, and each time her chest tightened with something she had thought lost forever. Her own grief, once an endless pit of despair, began to shift. The nights in her apartment were still long and empty, but now they were filled with thoughts of what Lily might need, how she might be comforted, what tomorrow's visit might bring. She felt guilt rise within her, the guilt of moving forward, the guilt of allowing another child to enter the space once occupied by Anna. At times she lay awake torn between the memory of her daughter and the fragile trust forming with Lily. But slowly she began to see that it was not betrayal. It was continuity, a chance to transform her own sorrow into something that could give life instead of drowning it. The decision to seek guardianship was not made lightly. She knew the obstacles she would face, the scrutiny of social workers, the endless paperwork, the doubts of those who would question why a wealthy, middle-aged woman would wish to adopt a child not her own. And indeed, when she began the process, the resistance was immediate. Officials raised questions about her motives, about her ability to care for a child after so many years, about her emotional stability. They examined her finances, her home, her background, probing every detail of her life. It was exhausting, humiliating at times, but Elizabeth pressed on. For the first time since her husband and daughter's deaths, she felt something worth fighting for. The bond with Lily deepened in quiet increments. There were no sudden declarations, no dramatic embraces, only the slow weaving of trust. One evening, when Elizabeth arrived, Lily reached out her hand without prompting, a simple gesture that nearly undid her. Another time, the child placed her drawing into Elizabeth's bag before she left, as though entrusting her with something precious. And gradually, the dress, though still clung to, became less of a barrier and more of a symbol they both shared. Elizabeth found herself smoothing its fabric when she knelt to speak with Lily, remembering the man who had bought it, remembering what it meant. Through the long months of procedures and evaluations, Elizabeth persevered. She answered every question, submitted to every inspection, endured every bureaucratic obstacle with patience she had not known she possessed. The thought of Lily alone in the world, left to drift through institutions, steeled her resolve. Each night she returned to her empty apartment, but it no longer felt quite as hollow, for in her mind the silence was interrupted by the faint echo of a child's voice, the sound of small footsteps that she hoped one day would fill her home. By the time spring arrived, Elizabeth realized she had already changed. The grief that once defined her had not vanished, but it had been reshaped. In its place was determination, fragile yet unyielding, to offer Lily what her father had given at the cost of his life, the certainty of being cherished. She stood in her daughter's old room one evening, looking at the shelves of books and the neatly folded bedspread, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine someone else there. It was not a replacement, but a continuation, a living testament that love could survive even the cruelest of losses. The path ahead remained uncertain, fraught with challenges she could not predict. But Elizabeth knew with clarity she had not felt in years that she was no longer drifting. She was moving, and she was moving toward a life that included someone else. And at the heart of it all was the image of a father's sacrifice, stitched into the fabric of a dress that would not be forgotten. The months of interviews, paperwork, and endless scrutiny drew themselves out like a long winter, each week demanding patience, resilience, and a steady heart. Elizabeth had thought herself hardened by grief, yet the process of proving she was worthy of caring for Lily tested her in ways she had not anticipated. Every official meeting felt like an examination of her soul. Could she provide stability? Was she truly fit to raise a child when she had lived alone for so long, when shadows of loss still haunted her nights? The questions came from faces that were polite but skeptical. From professionals who measured her answers with pens scratching across forms, as though love could be quantified on a checklist. And yet, despite the weight of bureaucracy, Elizabeth remained steady. The emptiness that once defined her days had been replaced by purpose, and she clung to it with a strength born of desperation. She attended parenting classes. She allowed social workers into her home. She submitted to medical and psychological evaluations that dredged up memories she would rather have buried. But she did it all with the quiet conviction that Lily's future was worth every intrusion, every judgment, every sleepless night spent wondering if she would be deemed enough. Through this time, her bond with Lily deepened in small but undeniable ways. Visits became less tentative, more natural. At first, Lily would still sit apart, clutching the stuffed rabbit, her eyes wary. But slowly she began to lean closer, to reach for Elizabeth's hand without prompting, to rest her head against her shoulder in rare moments of exhaustion. Elizabeth did not rush her, did not demand affection, but accepted each step as a fragile gift. The dress, though still worn with stubborn devotion, became less of a shield and more of a relic that both of them came to respect. Elizabeth began to see it as more than a garment. It was the thread connecting past and present, the embodiment of a father's sacrifice and a child's resilience. There were nights when Elizabeth would return home after visiting Lily and pause outside the door of her daughter's old room. She had not entered it often in recent years, unable to face the stillness that had remained since Anna's death. But now she would stand at the threshold and imagine Lily there, surrounded not by ghosts but by new beginnings. The thought was bittersweet, carrying both sorrow and hope. But for the first time, the scales tipped toward hope. It was not replacement. She knew that with certainty. Her daughter's memory would never fade, but perhaps it could coexist with new life, with laughter not yet heard within these walls. The day the final approval came was unremarkable to the world at large, but monumental to Elizabeth. She sat in a small courtroom, the air heavy with formality, her palms damp as she listened to the judge speak the words that would alter the course of both her life and Lily's. The decree was read, signatures placed upon paper, and in that moment Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. For 3 years she had lived in a fog of loss, but now, holding the small hand of the girl beside her, she stepped into a future that no longer belonged only to grief. She left the courthouse with Lily clutching her fingers tightly, her gaze fixed forward, as though both of them were walking together into a chapter that neither had dared to imagine. The first weeks in Elizabeth's home were a mixture of joy and adjustment. The apartment that had felt like a tomb of memories began to stir with the signs of life. Lily's footsteps echoed across the hardwood floors. Her small voice filled the air with questions and laughter. Her drawings spread across the table like seeds of a new season. Elizabeth watched her explore cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, moving through rooms that had once been silent shrines to the past. Slowly the house transformed. It was not that the memories of Michael and Anna vanished, but they blended into the rhythm of a new life, no longer suffocating but part of a greater tapestry. There were difficulties, of course. Nights when Lily woke crying for her father, when no amount of comfort could quiet the sobs that broke from her small frame. Days when she clung to the dress with renewed ferocity, refusing to let it out of her sight. Elizabeth learned to sit patiently, to let the grief flow, without rushing to end it, to simply be present. She realized then that love was not only about healing, but about standing in the storm with someone until it passed. And in those moments, as she held the child who trembled in her arms, she felt a strange strength rise within her, the kind she had not known since the days when her own family was whole. Gradually, Lily allowed herself to embrace the new life unfolding around her. She began to accept new clothes, warm sweaters, and sturdy shoes, though she still asked to keep the dress close, hanging on a small hook in her new room. Elizabeth honored this without question, knowing that it was not a garment, but a memory she was guarding. Over time, the dress became less of an anchor to sorrow and more of a relic of love, displayed like a sacred reminder of where she had come from and what had been given for her. Elizabeth herself changed in ways she had not foreseen. She rediscovered routines she thought had died with her family making breakfast for 2 instead of 1, walking hand in hand to the park, reading stories aloud before bed. She learned the cadence of Lily's laughter, The expressions that crossed her face when she was deep in concentration, the comfort of small arms wrapping around her waist without hesitation. These ordinary moments, so simple and unremarkable, became treasures that filled the hollow spaces of her heart. One evening, as spring sunlight faded into dusk, Elizabeth sat in the living room, while Lily drew pictures at the table. The sound of pencils scratching against paper blended with the distant hum of the city. She looked around the room and realized it no longer felt oppressive. The photographs of her husband and daughter still lined the shelves, but they did not accuse her anymore. Instead, they seemed to watch quietly, as if approving of the life she had chosen to build. She thought of Michael, the father who had given his last breath to keep his child safe, and in that thought she found a kinship. They were bound, he and she, by love that demanded sacrifice, by the willingness to give everything for a child. Elizabeth rose and entered Lily's room, pausing by the hook where the dress hung. The satin gleamed faintly in the soft light, the ribbon still tied with care. She touched the fabric gently, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it. It would always be a part of their story. It was not a symbol of tragedy anymore, but of love. And in that recognition, Elizabeth felt a quiet peace. As she turned back to the table where Lily sat, the child lifted her drawing and smiled shyly. It was a picture of a house with two figures standing outside, a tall woman with brown hair and a small girl in a bright dress. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt tears rise not from sorrow, but from gratitude. She knelt beside Lily, pulling her close, and whispered words that needed no answer. In that moment, she understood fully what she had known in fragments all along, that love could survive death, could cross the boundaries of loss, could weave broken lives into something whole again. The journey had not erased her grief. It never could. But it had reshaped it, turned it into a foundation upon which new life could grow. Elizabeth had not betrayed her husband or her daughter by embracing Lily. Instead, she had honored them by refusing to let love die with them. And as she held the child who was now her daughter in every sense of the word, she knew she had found not only purpose, but renewal. The dress remained, a fragile piece of fabric, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer just the final gift of a father to his daughter. It was now a bridge between past and future, between sacrifice and rebirth, between sorrow and hope. And under its quiet presence, Elizabeth and Lily began the rest of their story together, a story no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had been found. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Make sure to check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.